Leadership Story Talks, where we discuss the practices that engage, motivate, develop, retain, and attract people to businesses. We'll give you principles and tools based on real-world stories to leverage listening and storytelling to become a better leader and management professional. Leadership Story Talks is produced by Narrative, a company that focuses on personal storytelling for business.
Welcome to Leadership Story Talks. I'm Jerome DeRoy, CEO of Narrative.
And I'm Julienne Ryan, and I'm happy to be here for another version of our chats online.
Great, good to see you, Julienne. And we wanted to talk about a topic today that has to do with comfort and discomfort, and how we always seem to seek things that make us comfortable, as opposed to, things that don't make us comfortable, which seems pretty natural. But we've had some lessons learned recently where we've actually seen experiences where it might not be so bad to kind of get uncomfortable and get to a place of discomfort, because on the other side of that, there might be growth and transformation. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm charging myself basically to pay attention to the tension that happens when I'm about to do a group conversation or do an initiative, of what is giving me pause and what I'm thinking about, because that in that tension, there's a message that I need to figure out about what's causing it, what could block my listening, and what am I projecting onto that situation? So I am my own beta site right now for this purposes of this interview here. So please tell me you've had this experience, and I'm not the only one, but I've done it in New York. I've done it in other locations. I did it last week when I was in New Jersey at a conference. What's in my head and what do I need to pay attention before I can really honor the group and what I'm going to be doing with them?
Got it. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's interesting. I was just thinking about when we facilitate groups, or we meet someone for the first time and we're about to work with them. First thing we say, if they're in an environment, even on Zoom, actually, you might say, "Are you comfortable? Do you have what you need? Do you have a glass of water? Do you and this word comfortable keeps coming back, and we're kind of making sure that everybody's comfortable. But it's interesting because I'm also noticing, and that's perfectly, we should do that. But on the other side of that, and that's kind of the physical comfort of a situation. But then there's what's going on in the mind, and what are we bringing to any meeting, to any group. And as a facilitator, I'll speak for myself, and I'd love to hear what you think. But for me, when I walk into a room, I want to make sure that before I've walked into that room, I've had either a conversation or a writing practice where I've had an opportunity to actually think through what's in my mind right now about the person I'm meeting, the project that it is, and what are all of my, what we call obstacles. What are all of my obstacles around, is there any touch of envy? Is there any assumption that I'm making about that person that, makes me think that they are this type of person, even though I've never met them, or maybe I've had one conversation on the phone? So I try to clear all of that before I go into that meeting, so that I come in pretty much as a clear slate, or as much as I can, and really set those things aside, not try to get rid of them, but just set them aside and be aware of that. So that when I'm showing up fully as a listener that's really open, and I've kind of put all my judgments, assumptions, opinions about the person and the project that I'm working on to the side, because they probably aren't going to serve my intention, which is to really get to know that person and understand what it is that they need beyond that one phone call that we had before the work started.
Oh, that's helpful. I mean, I was laughing because when I was going to this one conference I mentioned last week, I got stuck in 3 hours of traffic for a trip that should only take me a little over an hour. So there was a lot of clearing that had to happen before I got there. So I thought of the methodology, but also in the room to be present when people are talking and giving me sometimes opinions that just came out of left field when they were just meeting me for the first few minutes. So to be patient and do more listening than talking, and just being mindful of that, not to correct, not to jump in, which is sometimes difficult. And then as recently as yesterday, sometimes people don't want to participate. And that word comfortable, I think, can be misleading in some situations. This person was sitting there and ready to say no to anything that she thought she was going to be asked to do. But on the flip side, when we finished the formal part of the workshop, she came over and shared so many things about herself that was quite surprising, deeply personal. So it was, I think, a case of being ready for people to be there on their own terms and to listen. And the story work we do sometimes is not, as we've discussed, being perfect thespians or sharing in the moment. It's what comes after it. So taking leaps of faith to be patient. Now, I had a choice there. I could have gone into, let me try to convince her mode about why it's important to share. Let me try to preach. But it was more about just saying, okay, that's okay. You can share whatever you want to share or don't want to share, and just be part of the experience. So it's a lesson learned. It's something new to experience every day. But it starts with me first. And I realized that I got to have a talk with my whole internal committee before I launch out into a group and go, who's showing up today for this meeting, and really test those variables out and see what needs to be quieted and what needs to be elevated.
Well, and that restraint that you had to not sort of push this person to share anyway, or to explain, look, there's only 2 or 3 people here, why don't we, there's no risk. You could have tried to comfort her. I'm using that word deliberately, and yet you didn't, and you stayed silent. And for me, what you were doing in that moment, even though there was no action on your part, you were actually creating a space. And you created a space for her to just be with that sort of silence, and with that decision that she made and expressed of, I'm not going to share today. And somehow that space that got created, and with the other people there, who I'm assuming were probably sharing, by the end of it, well, lo and behold, she's now sharing. So nothing's been imposed on this person. Nothing's been said to her in any kind of forceful way. But yet the space that was created allowed for something to come out. And I think that's really important, because I think most leaders, and we've talked about this in our podcast with Dan Lyons, the author of STFU, and the value of staying quiet. Many other guests, and people can look these up, have talked about listening and dialogue, et cetera. And what happens is that the instigator or the initiator of the meeting is actually quite silent the entire time. There's been a lot of preparation going in there, but it's really about creating a space in which people feel like they can share. And so I think that's important, this notion of how do I do that? How do I create a space for other people to show up in such a way that they can feel free to say, I'm not going to share anything, and then 30 minutes later or an hour later say, you know what, I am going to share something. There's that sense of permission that just because I said I wasn't going to share, I'm actually feeling good enough in this group that I can come back and change my mind. Because that's another thing that happens a lot, right? The mind changing. It's like politicians call it flip-flopping, even though, changing your mind is great, in my opinion.
I have actually a good story about that. We'll decide. But 2 words that came to mind when you were speaking was contracting. The person had a contract with herself about what was she willing to do or not do in situations. And it's almost like she renegotiated as the time went on. She shared a little bit during it, believe it or not. I was like, well, that's compelling. And then when we go into a situation, we're contracting with the group. So I was testing myself, because this was public. I was like, I clearly posted, whoever the sponsor posted, you'll be sharing a story, you'll be listening to it. And so I'm like, okay, the contract was clear that this experience is going to call on you by choice to say something. And then you could choose not to at some point. So it's figuring out, have I served the participants well by what their expectations are? And you're right, it's not about putting people on the spot and saying you must give confessions about something in your past. It's you have a choice of what you're going to share. So, and I've had a series of ones, but I'm going to test one with you offline when we finish recording. That you're always surprised what comes out of people. They go from not sharing to sharing incredible things that are quite surprising.
Yeah. It is kind of amazing. And so, how does that take us back to this idea of comfort and discomfort in your mind? Because what I'm thinking is that it's it's almost like a little bit of a misconception or something where or there's a kind of a myth around comfort and discomfort, and you must seek one or the other, or one is better than the other. Because what we're talking about now is actually what you do in order to have a really productive meeting, conversation, facilitation of a group, or whatever it is, and it all has to do with listening, and it starts with you, the individual.
I just had a voice from the past, and it has nothing to do with storytelling. When I was a kid growing up in Queens, I took ballet lessons from somebody who was Russian trained, grew up in Russia, moved to the States way back when. And her advice to all of us in the class is, if you're not feeling something, you're not working hard enough. So when you were there and you felt comfortable with the positions and the dance moves and finally got your posture right, she was like, you're not doing enough because you're not putting more of yourself into it. So that was a message that I heard when I was 4 years old. So I think it's interesting that many, many years later, it still comes up in me about, are you stretching enough? Are you doing enough to really push yourself? And it is uncomfortable. You look at you, I have a whole internal dialogue and complain, but it's the whole message at the end of the day is just go do it. And just go test it out and go give it a whirl. So I think that's the mission. It never changes. We're going to keep experiencing this every time we have conversations or we meet new people. And that's part of the joy and the challenge. We're not going to get to the good stuff if we just quiet down and just say we're not going to test ourselves and practice new behaviors and new ways of listening. Because, we have to follow the book, basically, where they say each conversation is a fresh experience, and it's a practice. You never conquer it. It's a practice. And I think that's the best word we can apply to conversations, presentations, teamwork. You're constantly learning and saying, okay, don't get too comfortable, because when you do, things don't go right, or we don't learn enough.
And what I also take away from that story about ballet is you pay attention to the feeling, right? What's going on within you. And that reminds me now, I'll have to tell my own story here, but a very short one. But I remember being this was about 10 years ago, one of our biggest clients to date at the time. It was a tech company, and that was starting out, but so you would think it's a startup, but actually it was kind of a little bit different, because it was the former CEO of a much bigger tech company who is now a billionaire and decided to create this company. And he was there at the company retreat, and he'd asked Narrative to come and do a session. And he was our very first session. We were going to be there for 2 days. So we had a whole, half a day on the first day and then another half day on the second day. And the first hour that we're there, we're presenting what listening is about. And that everything we've just said now, basically, pay attention to your obstacles. Everything starts with you. We have a responsibility to others so that we can bring our full listening to other people. So we're explaining all this, we're doing exercises. And I noticed from the corner of my eye that someone has earphones exactly like ours, and they're looking down at a device. And they're a little bit outside of the circle. Sorry. What were you going to say?
No, I'm laughing because I'm like, okay, that's bold,
Yes, exactly. And so, but it's from the corner of my eye, so I can't really see who it is. And then I just stopped the proceedings, because it was really I was starting to notice that other people were looking at this person, shifting in their seats around, so that they could accommodate that person who was moving. And then I stopped the proceeding. I said, there's an obstacle to my listening right in this moment, and I have to express it to the group because otherwise I feel like I'm not going to be able to continue. And I said, there's someone who seems to be on their phone right now. And the agreement that we had coming into this is that, we would all be listening to one another. And to do that, we have to sort of silence our devices. That's kind of the basics. And then so I turned to the person who was sort of looking up now, and it was the CEO. It was that guy.
Oh my God, the guy writes your check. Okay, fair done. Well done.
and so I asked him, is there an obstacle to your listening that's causing you to take that phone call? And he said, oh, well, I appreciate that. And yes, there is, because I didn't know that I was supposed to be on a board meeting call, and I can't miss this. So I want to ask the group if it's okay that I leave for about 30 minutes, and then I'll come right back. And I promise that after that, I'm putting the phone away. And, in my mind, I thought, great, okay, you can do that. And I really thought, we're not going to see him again.
Yes,
he came back 30 minutes later, exactly 30 minutes later, put his phone away, did all the group exercises, all the activities, was one of the most active and engaged members of the group. And I got a lot of feedback afterwards from people saying, that was great that you did that, because we then noticed how engaged he was.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not necessarily usual for this company. And they said, we saw him in a different light, and it kind of makes us trust him more. And so it was really, and that was uncomfortable for me. That's the point.
Oh, yeah.
It was uncomfortable for me to do that because it was our first instance with this client. I knew the history of this guy, and I thought, oh my God, all the possibilities
I
had envisioned coming
yes.
into this thing suddenly started to dissolve because of what I was about to do, right? And I was like, well, but in the end, it paid off. It showed me something, it showed him something, and it showed the entire group something. And I think we all grew because of it. So that feeling, and it started with a feeling in me. There's something that's not quite right in this group right now. And if I don't say anything, it's not going to be for the group. It's not going to be good for the group, but it could be good for my sense of comfort to not say anything. I could just let this go, let this slide, and feel comfortable, and I'll be fine. But knowing that there was something bigger than me at stake here, I had to kind of step in, right, and notice that. But it started with that feeling, and it started with a sense of responsibility of, if nobody else does this, well, here I'm the one. I'm the one who's got to do this.
Yes, indeed. And it's that whole motto of do what you preach. And you're like, really? He has to be the one to test this on. It couldn't be, not to diminish anyone's role, but why do I have to start with the top guy?
That's right.
But it was a valuable lesson, and you're right. And it was accountability, and you walked your talk on every level. But what a lesson to have. So there was your feedback afterwards from the group. And that's the interesting part when you're doing groups. They're watching, the participants are watching each other, but they're always watching you and watching how we act and react to situations. Because if it doesn't happen in that room where we're supposed to be the leaders, it won't happen elsewhere. And I think that's a big lesson to anybody else that's leading groups. Your group is watching what you're doing and how you're handling a situation, what you're making exceptions about and what you are not. So you stepped up, you did well there. So, yeah.
Yeah. And it's what you just said, the group is watching you. That's true of any company, any organization, any team. You're always watching the leader. What's that person doing, whether you're aware of it or not. And that person is modeling something for the team, for the group. And whether that's modeling responsibility or ownership, that's when you notice that certain teams, it seems like every individual is really embodying the message and taking things on and taking initiative. That comes from the top. That comes from people modeling that it's okay to do that, that there's that sense of permission that's been given from leadership. So yeah, I think that's those are good points. But that's kind of what I'm taking away here is notice the feeling first, and then know that it starts with you, and there's only you who can make some kind of change there. It's not going to come
Oh,
from
I
somebody
know.
else. Yeah,
Pay attention to the tension
exactly.
and just listen to your gut sometimes and see what happens.
That's
Yeah.
great. All righty. Well, that's great. I want to add here that if you've been inspired by this session, you can join us on September 7th when we begin our 3-part online workshop series. You can go to narrative.com. It's called Leading with Story Workshop to register and learn more about how you can find, craft, and tell a powerful leadership story of your own in a safe and supportive environment over the course of 3 one-hour sessions online.
And if you prefer to enroll yourself or your team in private sessions, we have options there. So go to the Narrative website for information and send a message about what you're considering to work on, so you can learn with us how to craft and present your stories and engage your teams and your audiences like nothing else before. We're always ready to listen to you.
Great. And as always, thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe anywhere you find your podcasts. Leave a review on your favorite podcast platform, because that's what creates word of mouth. And of course, we're also on YouTube. So don't forget to tune into YouTube and leave a review there, and watch previous podcast episodes, listen to previous podcast episodes. You can go and find blogs and many other free resources on narrative.com, NARATIV.com. Until next time, thanks, Julienne, for co-hosting with me.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure. Take care and all be well. Cheers.
For more information on the narrative listening and storytelling method and how it can help your business, go to narrative.com.